Hello and welcome. This is Chapter 7 of the American Pageant, The Road to Revolution, 1763 to 1775. Let's get started. First, I just want to say that I made another video already called Prelude to Revolution, which goes over the revenue-raising attempts by the British and the reaction to that in much more detail. This video really just goes over very quickly as a review. So if you'd like to see that, there is a link in the description. So reusing the key points from the Prelude to Revolution, it's a question of colonial autonomy, something that used to exist that was going to be slowly taken away after the French and Indian War. That, of course, brings about this sort of revolutionary response in the colonies. Another way to look at this is sort of the growing tension, the escalation of the conflict, and the increased polarization of the two sides. As the intensity of the conflict evolves, the ability for both sides to communicate decreases. There's a growing sense of republicanism in the colonies, and certainly it's inspired by the Enlightenment, but it's also modeled after the Greeks and the Romans. It's a representative style government, obviously, but one that possesses virtue. Citizens that could act because they had to, not because they wanted to. They didn't actively campaign to be politicians. They were sort of forced into the job because of their virtue and disinterestedness, which simply means that they were not acting in their interest. They could put that aside and act for the good of the whole. George Washington certainly is a good example of this type of character. He sets precedents such as the two-term tradition, after which he returned home to Mount Vernon to, farm his fields. There also were the more radical Whigs, and these are people who are kind of rabble-rousers. They attack things such as arbitrary power of the king, for example. They were concerned with patronage and bribes, and they warned of moral failure and corruption. Again, so sort of pointing out that perhaps there's a lack of virtue in this traditional source of authority. They also were very vocal for things such as the Stamp Act and opposing that. Just a refresher here, mercantilism was the economic policy that Britain pursued. Colonies existed to enrich the parent state, and the British would like to see the colonies help pay for the debt that was amassed during the French and Indian War. And so to do that, several revenue acts were passed, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the Tea Act, and all of these aroused this colonial resentment towards the system of mercantilism and towards the British. You start to see complaints about taxation without representation being unfair, being tyrannical. You could also make the case that the colonies simply outgrew the system of mercantilism, as it now was a barrier to their continued economic growth. You can see the debt was nearly doubled after the French and Indian War, and certainly people reacted very negatively towards things such as the Stamp Act. I know you've seen this cartoon several times already. It happens to be one of my favorites. Here's a piece of British propaganda we also looked at already in class, depicting the Sons of Liberty. Again, we would see them as patriots. Some would see them as patriots in the colonies. Others would see them as an angry mob. It would be false to say that the colonies or the colonists were unified necessarily. That's just not true. But this section, this chapter, talks about moving towards colonial unity. And the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 is a great example of that. Again, sort of an intercolonial organization that really does promote the idea of non-importation and was successful in doing that. Following that, we start to see the emergence of committees of correspondence. And again, this is sort of a shared experience now. Colonies are communicating about common issues using a common language, and it leads to, or it adds to that idea of escalation and polarization, escalation of the conflict and polarization of those involved. And one of the questions I had asked in class was, are you for order or are you for liberty? Are you witnessing the Boston Tea Party and saying, I think this is a great idea to stand up and be vocal and active for a principle, or are you more concerned about the protection of private property and perhaps personal fears of being attacked as well? And so following the Boston Tea Party, the British respond with what they call the coercive acts. Of course, they're known as the intolerable acts here in the colonies. The most significant of which may have been the Boston Port Bill. Closing the port of Boston punished everybody, not just those involved in the destruction of private property. We also saw the meeting of the First Continental Congress directly after that, 1774. And here's a cartoon showing sort of the colonial reaction to the intolerable acts. This first Continental Congress did involve 55 men meeting in Philadelphia. They met and spoke for a length of time, as you can see here. They drafted a Declaration of Rights. They appealed to British American colonies, to the king, to the British people, and all of which are sort of stately measures. But they also created the association, or sometimes called the Continental Association. And this is sort of a method that was used by a Congress which did not really possess the authority or the means to enforce this non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption approach. And so it uses social pressure. It used average people like you and I who really just kind of put leverage on people to not consume British products. And several methods may have been used through intimidation. I know that names of those who violated this embargo may have been printed in local newspapers. So again, it's sort of identifying an us versus them kind of situation. Now, in April 1775, the British had sent troops towards Lexington to capture supplies, guns and ammunition that had been stored there. And they did confront colonial Minutemen at Lexington, where 8 Americans, were shot and killed. The British then continued on to Concord, and they were met with American resistance. They suffered over 300 casualties and 70 deaths. And at this point, you can sort of consider that the American War for Independence has begun. Here you can see the route that was taken from the Boston and Charleston area through the northwest there. And of course, this iconic image of Paul Revere in his midnight ride. At the start of the war, the British population was 3 times that of the colonies, and Britain also had a much larger navy and much more economic power than the colonies. But they had other things going on. They had other wars they're involved with. They had this sort of constant threat of the French as well, so they couldn't pour all of the resources into the New World. Also, in the colonies, provisions for British soldiers were not necessarily adequate in all cases. Officers are not necessarily well trained in all cases. And troops were operating far from their home base, sort of in these frontier regions, as the colonists basically evacuated cities and went off to fight in the more rural parts of the country. So at the start of the war, the colonies were poorly organized. They were, however, fighting a defensive war, which meant that they didn't necessarily have to win. They just had to fight long enough that the British would give up. They also had a more intimate knowledge of their terrain, allowing them to use that to their advantage as well. The colonies also got help from the Marquis de Lafayette. He's a Frenchman who was made a major general in the Colonial Army at the age of 19. And he actually gave roughly $200,000 of his private money to this rebellious movement. In 1781, the Articles of Confederation are ratified, and they are going to be the first centralized government of the United States. They are a weak central government, but a government nonetheless. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough hard currency in the colonies to fund this rebellion, and so paper money was needed, the value of which depreciated greatly. Some people wouldn't even accept it. Here's the Marquis de Lafayette. Another obvious issue in this colonial war effort would be the lack of food and military supplies. At Valley Forge, for example, American men went without food for 3 days in the wintertime, so that's obviously not good for morale or for your ability to go off and fight in a battle. The colonies did have the help of Baron von Steuben, this German who helped to standardize military training in the colonies. That's obviously a great asset. But there's a problem with slaves that are being enticed to run away and join the British. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation in 1775 which promised freedom for any enslaved blacks in Virginia who joined the British Army. It's cold. That's it. Thanks for watching. Once again, this was a brief overview of much of Chapter 7, just sort of filling in the gaps that my last video, Prelude to a Revolution, didn't quite hit. If you'd like some more information on the Revenue Acts and so forth, please see that video. There's a link in the description. I'll see you back for Chapter 8, where we meet this guy, Thomas Paine. Take care.